distraction overall. So when I also want to consider the visual side and the cognitive side, and I want to quantify that. So how can I quantify the performance of the driver for both conventional and semi-automated vehicles? Because nowadays we're seeing these being rolled over. And so it was interesting for us not just to look at conventional cars, but also as semi-automated ones. So we tested two scenarios. One was a city/suburban scenario with a person driving manually. So this is kind of a conventional car. And then we also tested a highway scenario. And the highway scenario was targeting a semi-automated vehicle. And we had basically what is called the takeover problem of a car driving autonomously, and then disengaging and transitioning into manual conventional driving. So basically a car that was driving itself, and at some point, in conjunction with a highway exit, the driver had actually to take over and regain manual control of the car. Which is a pretty standard problem, and that's because AVs are being rolled over in highway environments. It's a little bit easier, and so they typically are not allowed to remain engaged in autonomy when you take a highway exit. So we were kind of looking into that scenario. What we were measuring were mostly speed reactions, time to input, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, vehicle trajectory, and then also eye tracking. So let's look at the methodology. This was a human-in-the-loop setup. You can see a picture here. Hilary, can you see my cursor moving on the screen? Okay, so this, you can see it's a BMW Series 6. A person was sitting inside. They had a 220-degree screen in front of them. They had a back screen. So if they looked in the rearview mirror or on side mirrors, they could see the back and the traffic and the cars. We tested somewhat of a small population, 32 test drivers. And we were doing eye tracking. So we had a bunch of cameras that you can see mounted here in the front, the dashboard, and also in the back. So we were testing, as I mentioned, two scenarios, city and highway. So the city one was manual, the highway had the transition between automated to manual, and two interfaces, manual texting and voice to text or vocal dictation. And the big thing was that we had a phone mounted in the car. People were supposed to monitor GPS at all times. So we had a GPS running, telling them what to do. So they were supposed to follow the instructions. We had kind of fail-safe if they didn't follow the instructions, but everybody was good. They all went where they were supposed to go. And then on top of that, at some point, they would receive one or two texts. And when we were testing the manual interface, they would need to type it in. And when we were testing the vocal interface, they had to basically dictate to somewhat of a Google type of reply. And this is how the test was structured. They came in, it was about 1 hour of test for each person. They came in and we were asking a bunch of questions about their history, their driving, their texting behavior. Everything was anonymous. Then we did a little bit of practice. Then we had the actual test. And then after the test, a post-drive feedback. And you can see that the big test was actually comprised of 4 individual portions. And that's because we were testing 2 scenarios with 2 interfaces. So a total of 4 combinations, which were randomized by every person. So everybody would get the orders slightly different. And we were testing 2 for the city scenario and 2 for the highway, again, manual and vocal interfaces. In between each of those tests, we had additional surveys. So we were asking a lot of questions that I will cover kind of later. So let's take a look at some of the results, and we're going to start with the time to input. So time to input is really, again, a time metric. So kind of how quick is the driver to engage with throttle, brakes, steering. And so let's take a look at some of the examples. I'm not going to cover everything, but the full report is coming out, and so you can take a look there. So the first thing that we were trying to look at was within the city scenario, how fast people were reacting at a traffic light. So imagine that this is kind of the intersection we were testing. The car was coming from this way and it was reaching the intersection, and they would reach this intersection when the traffic light was actually red. Through that process, they received 2 texts, one kind of far away from the traffic light and one while they were stopped at the traffic light. So I'm going to analyze the second one first. So the car was stopped here, red traffic light, and we were testing how quick they were in restarting the car, so what is called time to throttle, after the light turned red, after the light turned green. So they were stopped at red, and then the traffic light became green, and at the same point, at the same time, they would receive a text that was awaiting a reply. And so we were repeating this twice, manually and vocally, and then kind of analyzing the distribution of what people had done. And what we found was that the time to throttle distribution was not statistically different for either the vocal or manual interface. The dark gray is manual, the light gray is vocal. You can see that the two peaks are very close to each other. The shape is really close. So when we did statistical testing, basically the test was not able to discern any difference between the two. So it was pointing towards the fact that these two were actually instances of the same distribution of the same thing occurring. And so we couldn't really prove that one would alter how you react to the external stimulus of a change in a traffic light. So we were also looking at highway scenario for time to input. And here we had kind of a more complex problem, the disengagement of the autonomy. So you can see here kind of a zoom out of the highway environment. This green portion here is where the exit you were supposed to, coming from the rightmost lane where automated driving was engaged, it would disengage at this point, and you were supposed to merge following GPS instruction with this green new lane for the exit. And the text was received here, so right before the disengagement. So we were looking at how quickly, and then also how good, but I'll get to that later, how quickly the driver would engage with throttle, brakes, and steering. And you have this table here, which shows kind of the means for manual and vocal in all the inputs. And you might notice a little bit of variation in the mean, but when you actually look at the entire distribution, again, as it was done before, the distributions were not dissimilar. And so our statistical tests showed that they were not statistically significantly different. So we went on to analyzing the vehicle trajectory. So a bunch of different things on how the driver was actually handling the car in terms of drift, lane departure, stopping distances. And in the city scenario, what I did not tell you before is that when you were approaching the intersection, there was actually a car in front of you. And so you had to maintain distance from that car. And this is where the first text message that I didn't really talk about played a role. So you would receive a text message kind of in this situation, actually a little bit before you would see this, where the traffic light is really tiny, it's really here, you cannot see it, but you can clearly see that there's a car in front of you. And what we were analyzing in this chart, you can kind of understand a little bit. Over time, we wanted to look at how you were engaging with throttle and brake, and so how your speed was changing, and also how you were gauging the distance from the car in front of you. So you can see that the first line on the top is actually the distance from the vehicle, and this bold one is your speed. So these bumps are indicative of a person that is not having like a stable, consistent behavior. They are speeding up and slowing down. And it's interesting to note that they are corresponding to these vertical lines, which is actually when you receive a text, when you send out the text, and when you see finally the traffic light changing color. So what we found out was that participants using the manual interface were engaging sooner with the phone, and we're also engaging at higher speeds. Also kind of obvious, but participants were faster in composing a message vocally. Yet when we were looking at the distance and how you were managing interaction with the other traffic, there was no statistical difference once more in the actual distance between the vehicle. For the highway, the discussion is a little bit more complex, and what you see here is two pictures that kind of look exactly the same, and that's the point. Here we have the manual interface performance, and here we have the vocal interface performance. What is this? The gray lines in here are all the trajectories that we observed that the drivers undertook after they took over control of the car. So basically in here at the very beginning where you don't see anything, the car was driving autonomously. A perfect car that continues being aligned with the center line would follow this red line. So this zero line is a perfect trajectory of a person that regains control of the car, takes the exit lane, always being aligned with the middle of the lane, and then goes off the highway environment. So this is what our autopilot would have done. And then all the gray is what the people actually did. And then we have like mean trajectory, standard deviation, confidence intervals. But you can see that actually they look similar to each other. We did statistical tests to analyze the distribution of the mean, of the standard deviation, the peaks, the oscillations, the number of peaks. So we did an integral, which is kind of a stability type of thing, like looking at the entire drift or lateral offset for each vehicle. And once more, no statistically significant difference observed. So we were not happy. Let's continue to analyze the data. Let's look at eye tracking. Eye tracking was interesting. It was the first time that my team and I were working with this technology, and we were looking at the visual distraction, right? So in a way, the trajectory and the time can be proxies for that cognitive distraction that we talked about, but we were now wanted to look at the visual type of thing. So how long are you looking at the cell phone for? We were measuring this dwelling time, or better, maximum dwelling time, which is the longest time interval in seconds that you spent continuously looking at the same thing. So the longest you looked at your cell phone for was 5 seconds, or 2 seconds, 1 second. And then we were also looking at what's called the classified time percentage, which is just the percentage of how much time you spent overall on each of those categories. Like in the entire test, 50% of your time you looked at the windshield, 15% of your time at the rear view mirror, and so on and so forth. So that we could basically collect this 100% of where you were looking through the entire test. And what we found was, a bunch of different data. The dwelling time was a little lower for the vocal when we're talking about the phone. Here, I just have the phone and the windshield. I didn't really provide the data for the others because these are kind of the two main ones. The windshield, so looking at the road in front of you, was a little bit higher in terms of dwelling time for the vocal. Same thing for the percentages, so it kind of makes sense. But overall, once you look at the distributions across all participants, there was no statistically significant difference observed. So what does this mean? I spent the last 15 minutes telling you that there's no statistical difference whatsoever. Well, actually, that's not the most interesting part of what we found out. I told you before that what we were doing before the test began and after the test, as well as in between each of the repetition, was asking a bunch of questions to people. And this is where what we call subjective assessment or subjective measures comes into play. Subjective measures, which is typically replying to surveys, give us information about what each person thought, about what they were doing, about what they were recollecting, how they felt about the different interfaces. And in a very, very brief summary, we started with what is called NASA TLX, which is a survey developed by NASA a long time ago that measures what is called the task load index, which is a way of understanding how intensive or how demanding a person perceived a task to be. And some of the things we were looking at were the mental demand and the effort, like how hard did you have to work mentally and physically. And people had a 20-point scale. They were putting in their kind of their rating for each repetition of the test. And this is where we found statistical significance. So it was very clear with no doubt that everybody thought it was higher effort for manual texting. It was higher mental demand for manual texting. And this is, again, intuitive, but it was good that it was, statistically significant. But then we went deeper. We were asking them about, did you think you performed better? Did you think it was safer? And also here, the results were pretty clear. We were asking about personal preference. We were asking about safety preference, what was more difficult to use for all the different interfaces, and a host of other questions, which, again, I refer you to the full report because there's about 30 pages of results just for the subjective assessment. So vocal was easier to use. The drivers felt safer with the vocal. And then this was a big one. We were asking them about the safety compromise, and everybody was saying, yes, we felt most unsafe when using the manual texting, and in particular when using manual texting in the highway scenario, which makes sense because they were traveling at a higher speed. And so they felt most unsafe there. They were also saying that they thought they performed better when they were using the vocal interface. So that's why it was very interesting, because if we bring it all together, On the operational side, participants perceived that there was a safety improvement for the vocal interface. It was a lower mental workload. It was lower effort. They thought they performed better. Also, the composition of the text was faster with the voice command. And on the downside, people were also prone to engage with the phone sooner when they were provided with a manual interface. Yet, while all of that, which is what you ask people, and they say, oh yeah, vocal was much better. Yet when you look at the engineering side of things, which is the measured quantities, like what was actually happening in terms of both the person and the car, which is the time to input, response to external stimuli, the vehicle trajectory, the gaze tracking, we could not find any statistical significance. What does this mean? It means that it's very intuitive to bring forward something like a hands-free regulation, but we couldn't prove that there's a safety improvement. We could not prove that there was any statistical difference. And I didn't mention much about the practice phase, but we were actually recording them so that we would have a baseline, that we would compare the texting with the no texting situation. Manual and vocal were equally bad. So a person was doing better when they were, 100% just driving. And so this is a problem, because when you're doing a regulation, it means that we need to do more research. It means that it's not obvious, right? So there are a lot of limitations, and with that, I want to conclude and open it up for questions. But the idea is that this was preliminary. We had a very small sample size, 32 test drivers. We started with 50, but then of the clean data, people that completed everything, so perfect tests, we had 32, which was good enough. It was a total of 128 data points. There's some bias because this was a simulation environment, and so there's no guarantee that there's like, it's going to work exactly the same in the real life, and also after you get acquainted with doing this a lot of times. Although we could talk more about that. They were trained with the interface. It was not new for them. We provided everything with training at least a week before, so the interface and the phone were not new to them. They knew how to use it. We were testing them before the test. And also, these results are specific to the HMI, the human-machine interface that we tested and the environments we tested. If you do this in a completely different road, with a completely different weather, with a completely different phone, positioned in a different place, it could also vary, right? So with that, I want to close the main presentation, so we have at least 5 or 6 minutes for questions. I am actually going to close this so I can open up the chat and see some of the questions, unless either you want to moderate that. But
yeah, I'll help with moderating, just because we've got a couple that have come in. One of them is about this kind of nature of, well, we're working with a small sample size, and we're kind of looking at the average driver when you're doing the statistical testing, but that our safety issues are really about the extremes, these smaller numbers of folks that are causing the actual severe problems. And so what do you think about that in terms of how this research has come about? And then another question, kind of pushing this forward a little bit, is this idea of you were looking at these distractions, the texting, the information being given to the participants as a mechanism for, will that cause distraction? But what about in the future of autonomous, when people are just kind of drifting off? Could these tools be actually used to bring people's attention back to driving? So almost a flip way of how you're looking at. So.
All right, so these are actually a lot of questions. So let's actually start from the beginning on the average driver type of thing. So when you look at the literature, the first thing that appears obvious is that young drivers tend to engage more with this technology. So that's the first thing on our sample. We targeted people between 18 and 48 because that's statistically been showed to be the age range of people that are more prone to texting. If you look at the data on distracted driving and the 37,000 deaths and so on and so forth, well, that's a picture of the entire US driver population, if you want to call that average driver, but that's kind of the whole, right? So what we did in our pre-assessment was asking them, do you engage with your phone? How often? We had kind of an average of 2 texts per drive type of thing, and people were reporting driving more than once per day. So I don't know, if you drive at least from and to work, just 2, that's 4 texts while driving per day, which is higher than what we had seen for 2016, but is actually pretty consistent with what we found in other studies in the literature on distracted driving. So our sample population kind of, in terms of how many times you engage with your phone, was well aligned with an average distribution that we found in literature. And other than that, we tried to keep on diversity. We matched the FEWAD data in terms of distribution between male and female. But yeah, so that's why it is a limitation, and then this is true for any study. I want to say, it may sound a little bit ridiculous, but recruiting and making sure that these people come is the toughest part of this entire research. It takes a lot of effort to make sure you are capturing a diverse population. We partnered with the SIMS provider so that we could access a broader population. But I don't want to steal too much time on that. So on the causing distraction, drowsiness, so this research was aimed at distracted driving where the distraction is coming out from the outside. You were hinting to a much more interesting problem, which is that of, can we actually turn this into something positive? And the idea is that we need to put a threshold. We need to be careful when we talk about what is programmed to catch your attention from the car. So it's coming from inside the vehicle. It could also be, routed remotely from the outside, but it's kind of an internal thing, and an outside distraction, like a text, right? So if my mom is texting me while I'm driving, yes, that may, bring me back to the environment of, oh, hey, I'm actually sitting in a car that has been driving autonomously for 30 minutes, but it's not planned, right? So there's research that has shown or is targeting, looking into what is the longest or the shortest interval of time that a sound, a beep, a warning has to be provided so that a person performs better with these engagements after autonomy if an external stimulus is present. And it's very tricky to do that research. I want to say that right now there's no conclusive result. Why is it very tricky? Because it's really dependent on how you provide that disengagement. What we were testing here was going out of a highway, and when you take that exit, the people were trained, they knew that autonomy could not handle the exit. So a participant was told, hey, should the GPS tell you to take an exit, just be prepared to take over control. The car will warn you about it, but the car cannot drive autonomously off the highway. And if you think of another situation, that's the one test I saw where there was a construction site and people were receiving beeps at different intervals of times to just make sure they were attentive, and then they could regain manual control and then go in the other lane to surpass the construction zone. That's something that is an external visual cue. So it's hard to tell that the result is, displaying certain characteristics simply because of the beeping sound that was interleaved every 2 seconds, every 5 seconds, or rather than because, you could actually look outside and see that there were orange cones or whatever, the construction was coming. So it's becoming more and more a problem of how you standardize the set of conditions that you're actually testing, because you need to be extremely careful in separating the contributions from the particular HMI you're testing, which could be, an alert from the car, like a warning displayed in the car. It could be a sound. It could be some sort of text, of course, but also with what you see on the outside. If you test it with rain, it could be that you have that implicit assumption that you are in a more dangerous situation because it's raining. And so you're going to be more attentive, right?
Okay, great. So I know that we want to wrap up really quickly, but there was a clarifying question. And I don't know if we may have skimmed over it quickly, but if I remember what you said, you did test people who were just driving along, and they were just driving, and that if they used any form of cell phone interface, they were equally bad compared to no distraction. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yes. So during the
Okay.
practice phase, and people didn't know that, but during the practice phase, they had about 5 minutes to test around. We were actually testing them within the exact same maneuvers that they would do later. They didn't know that, but to get them accustomed to the simulator. And then after a while, we would ask them like, oh, do you feel comfortable? Do you think that you would actually be ready to start? And when they said yes, that's when we actually took them through those maneuvers that we needed to record to establish a baseline without the cell phone, so that afterwards we could record that. So they had kind of this practice. As soon as they felt comfortable and they felt that it was a good level, we would record them. Well, we were recording also before, but we would save those as portions of kind of the baseline, and then do that comparison later.
All right. Well, to respect everyone's time, I think we will wrap up now. The one thing I will reiterate is that Francesca's report will be published probably tomorrow. We've got it ready to go, and it will be published on our website tomorrow. And since you've all registered, I'll make sure that MTI sends out a link to that report to all of you. And I've worked with Dr. Favaro for a long time. I'm sure she'd also be happy to respond to additional questions offline. So thank you so much, Dr. Favaro. This has been great. And I hope you all join us for a future webinar. So thank you.